In the sun-scorched badlands of Texas, fate is about to deal a deadly hand. When 6 desperate escaped prisoners stumble upon the Willow Creek Ranch, all they see is an aging cowboy working his land alone, an easy mark for men with nothing left to lose. They don't know that they're looking at John Shadowhand McCall, the most feared gunslinger of the frontier era. A man whose name once made outlaws tremble from Dodge City to Tombstone, whose lightning-fast draw has left 27 notches on his gun, and whose reputation for ruthless justice earned him a place in frontier legend. This isn't just another tale of frontier violence. This is the story of how 6 hardened criminals chose the wrong ranch on the wrong day, not realizing they'd walked straight into the territory of a man who'd spent 30 years trying to forget his violent past. But when these outlaws threaten the peaceful life he's built, they're about to learn why the old-timers still speak of Shadowhand McCall in whispers. What follows is the account of how one legendary gunfighter would remind the West that some legends never fade, they just wait for the right moment to resurface. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold as John McCall's weathered boots crunched across the morning frost. His calloused hands worked methodically, checking fence posts and mending breaks in the wire, the same routine he'd followed for the past 3 decades. The morning air carried the sweet scent of sage and prairie grass, a constant reminder of why he'd chosen this remote stretch of land to begin his second life. His mare, Belle, nickered softly from the nearby corral, her breath visible in the cool morning air. McCall paused, his hand instinctively brushing against the worn walnut grip of the colt still strapped to his hip. Old habits died hard, even after 30 years of peace. The weight of the gun was both a comfort and a burden, like carrying a piece of his past that refused to let go. The ranch house stood silent against the rising sun, its wooden walls weathered by countless seasons. Sarah would have loved how the morning glory had finally taken to climbing the porch trellis she'd installed all those years ago. His wife had always believed in making beauty grow in harsh places. Even now, 15 years after her passing, he maintained her garden, though his rough hands were better suited to gun leather than tender shoots. From the ridge above his property, McCall could see clear to the town of Willow Creek, 5 miles distant. Most folks there knew him only as the quiet rancher who came in once a month for supplies. The younger generation didn't recognize the name Shadowhand McCall, and that's exactly how he wanted it. The older folks, the ones who remembered the bloody days of the frontier, they knew. He could see it in their eyes, the way they'd duck, their heads in respect, or sometimes fear, when he passed. Sheriff Tom Bradley was among the few who knew the full weight of McCall's history. Their monthly chess games had become a ritual over the years, though they spoke more in comfortable silences than words. Last week, Bradley had mentioned trouble brewing, a prison break near El Paso. 6 men, all killers, but that was 100 miles away, and McCall had long since hung up his reputation as a manhunter. His fingers traced the familiar pattern of scars on his left hand, remembering the gunfight in Dodge City that had earned him the name Shadowhand. 23 years. Old facing down the notorious Clayton brothers. 4 men dead in less time than it took to blink, and him with a bullet through his palm that somehow hadn't stopped his draw. The papers had called it impossible, supernatural even. The truth was simpler. He'd simply been faster, more willing to die than his opponents. The morning sun climbed higher as McCall finished his fence work. A lone hawk circled overhead, its cry carrying across the empty prairie. He'd chosen this life of solitude after Sarah's death, when the weight of all the killing had finally become too much to bear. She'd been the one to help him find peace, to show him there was more to life than the reputation he'd built. The promise he'd made at her grave still held. No more gunfights, no more killing. He'd become a rancher, nothing more. The ranch was small by Texas standards, just 80 acres of decent grazing land and a modest herd of cattle. but it was enough. The work kept his hands busy and his mind quiet most days. Sometimes, in the deep of night when the wind howled across the prairie like a lost soul, he'd still dream of gun smoke and the thunder of revolvers. He'd wake reaching for his gun, only to find himself alone in the darkness, the past as distant as the stars. At noon, McCall led Belle to the water trough, watching as she drank deeply. The sun beat down mercilessly now, and the horizon shimmered with heat haze. His weathered face, lined with age and memory, reflected in the water's surface. At 58, he was well past his prime as a gunfighter, but his eyes remained sharp, his hands steady. The skills were still there, buried deep but not forgotten, like a language learned in childhood. The distant sound of hoofbeats caught his attention, riders on the road to town probably, but something in their rhythm made him pause. Too many horses, moving too fast for ordinary travelers. His hand found the Colt's grip again, an old friend offering cold comfort. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the way he used to before trouble found him in his younger days. The peaceful life he'd built was about to be tested. And despite all his promises, despite the years of quiet and the oath he'd sworn on Sarah's grave, John, Shadowhand McCall knew that some choices weren't about keeping promises. They were about surviving to make new ones. The afternoon heat had driven McCall inside, where memories hung as thick as the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. He sat in Sarah's old rocking chair, the wood creaking a familiar rhythm as he cleaned his Colt, another habit he'd never managed to break. The gun oil's sharp scent brought him back to that day in Tombstone 32 years ago, when everything changed. He'd been younger then, his reputation already a weight around his neck. The name Shadowhand McCall had spread across the territories like wildfire after the Dodge City incident, drawing every young gun looking to make a name for themselves. But it was the Bannister gang that finally forced him to confront the true cost of his notoriety. They'd come for him on a Sunday morning of all times. Sarah had been in church. Thank God for that small mercy. 5 men, led by James Bannister himself, the most notorious outlaw south of the Mason-Dixon. They'd called him out, as so many had before. But this time was different. They'd brought insurance. The mayor's young daughter Elizabeth, no more than 12 years old. McCall's hands paused on the gun barrel, the memory as clear as yesterday. He'd stepped into that street knowing it would end badly, one way or another. The girl's terrified eyes had met his across the dusty thoroughfare, and in that moment he'd made a choice that would haunt him for decades. The speed of his draw had become legend, but few knew the truth of what happened that day. In the split second between reaching for his gun and the first shot, he'd seen Sarah watching from the church steps, horror etched on her face. He'd killed all 5 men, had to save the girl, but the look in his wife's eyes told him everything about the price of such skill. "You're not a killer, John," Sarah had told him later that night, tending to his wounds. "You're a man who's had to kill. There's a difference." Her gentle hands had belied the steel in her voice. "But if you keep walking this path, soon there won't be." The memory of her words still carried the same weight today. Sarah had been right, as she so often was. It took 3 more years and 16 more notches on his gun before he finally understood the full meaning of her warning. By then, the legend of Shadowhand McCall had grown beyond his control, a dark shadow that threatened to swallow whatever good was left in him. The final straw came in El Paso, 1893. A gang of rustlers had recognized him, decided to make their reputation by taking down the famous gunfighter. They'd ambushed him and Sarah on their way home from a supply run. His speed with a gun saved his life that day, but not hers. The doctor said it was quick, that the stray bullet had killed her instantly, but that knowledge brought little comfort in the years that followed. McCall rose from the rocking chair, his joints protesting the movement. Crossing to the fireplace mantel, he lifted the small daguerreotype that stood there. the only picture he had of Sarah. She smiled out from the silver surface, forever young, forever untouched by the violence that had ultimately claimed her life. "I kept my promise, Sarah," he whispered to the empty room. After her death, he'd holstered his gun for what he thought would be the last time, bought this remote ranch with the bounty money he'd accumulated, and disappeared into anonymity. The legend of Shadowhand McCall faded into frontier mythology, just another tale told around campfires, but the skills remained, honed by years of survival. Every morning, before the sun rose, he still practiced his draw. Empty gun, empty hand, muscle memory that refused to fade. The speed was still there, though he prayed he'd never need it again. Some things, once learned, became as natural as breathing. The distant sound of hoofbeats grew louder, pulling him from his reverie. Moving to the window, McCall watched a cloud of dust approaching along the road. His keen eyes picked out details that set off warning bells in his mind. Too many riders, moving too fast, their horses looking worn. The kind of desperate riding he'd seen before, usually from men with the law on their trail. The irony wasn't lost on him. 30 years of peaceful ranching, and trouble still found its way to his door. He thought of the prison break Sheriff Bradley had mentioned, of 6 killers loose in the territory. His hand moved unconsciously to his gun belt, checking the familiar weight of the Colt. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, "The past has a way of catching up, John. The question is, what will you do when it finds you?" The sun hung low, in the western sky, painting the clouds blood red. Soon, McCall knew, he would have to answer that question, and for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't sure what his answer would be. The El Paso Territorial Prison stood like a fortress of stone and iron against the harsh Texas landscape. In the pre-dawn darkness, 6 men huddled in the shadow of the prison's western wall, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood dripped from Marcus Cole's knuckles, evidence of the brutal fight that had left 2 guards dead in the prison yard. "We ain't got much time," Cole whispered, his voice carrying the harsh edge of a man who'd spent 12 years behind bars. At 45, he was the oldest of the group, his face a roadmap of scars and hard decisions. "They'll be doing bed check in 10 minutes. Beside him, Billy the Kid Thompson, no relation to the famous outlaw, though he wished otherwise, fidgeted with the makeshift lockpick he'd spent months crafting from stolen metal scraps. "Almost got it, boss." The lock on their stolen horses' chains clicked open, and 6 tethered horses shifted nervously in the darkness. The other 4 men represented a rogues gallery of the territory's worst. Jake Martinez, a former cavalry scout turned murderer. The Webster brothers, Tom and Frank, serving life for a string of bank robberies that left 8 dead, and Samuel Snake Eyes Cooper, a gambler whose preferred method of winning involved a derringer and a shallow grave. The prison alarm bell shattered the night silence. "Mounting up! Now!" Cole's command cut through the chaos as guards' shouts echoed across the yard. Gunfire erupted from the watchtowers, muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness like lightning. They rode hard through the night, pushing their stolen horses to the limit. The sound of pursuit faded by dawn, but Cole knew better than to slow down. He'd spent years planning this escape, memorizing maps smuggled in by sympathetic visitors, studying the patterns of frontier law enforcement. "We need supplies," Martinez called out as the sun climbed higher. "Horses won't last another day at this pace." The former scout's assessment was grim but accurate. Their mounts were nearly spent, foam flecking their flanks. "There's nothing out here," Tom Webster spat, his face sunburned and desperate. "We're gonna die in this goddamn desert." Cole reined his horse to a stop atop a small rise, studying the horizon. The morning heat created shimmering mirages in the distance, but his experienced eyes caught something solid, a thin line of fence posts stretching across the landscape. "Not nothing," he said, pointing. "There's a ranch out there." "Snake." Eyes Cooper shaded his eyes, squinting at the distant property. "Looks isolated. Might be worth checking out." They approached cautiously, using what cover the rolling terrain provided. Through his prison-issued binoculars, stolen from a dead guard, Cole observed the ranch for nearly an hour. One man, working alone, older, though he moved with purpose. A small herd of cattle, a well-maintained barn, and a modest house speaking of relative prosperity. One old-timer, Cole reported to his waiting men, looks like he's alone, probably got food, fresh horses, maybe even money stashed away. A cruel smile played across his face. Should be easy enough to convince him to share. Billy Thompson shifted uneasily in his saddle. Something ain't right about this. Place is too neat, too organized for just one man. You getting soft, Billy? Snake Eyes sneered. After what we did to get out, one rancher ain't nothing to worry about. Cole silenced them both with a sharp gesture. We'll watch a while longer. Make sure he's alone. Then we'll pay our host a friendly visit. His hand touched the stolen revolver in his waistband, and if he's not feeling hospitable, well, won't be the first time we've had to take what we need. They withdrew to a hidden canyon half a mile from the ranch, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid detection. As the day wore on, they took turns watching the property through the binoculars. The rancher maintained his routine, mending fences, tending cattle, the mundane tasks of agricultural life. Look at him, Frank Webster said with disgust. Probably never had a hard day in his life, just some soft old man playing cowboy. Martinez wasn't so sure. Years of cavalry training had taught him to read men, and something about the rancher's movements set off warning bells. He carries himself like a fighter, he muttered, but kept his concerns to himself. After 12 hours on the run, he was too tired to argue. As sunset approached, Cole gathered his men. Here's how we play this, he said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a leader even in prison. Thompson and Cooper, you circle around to the back of the house. Webster brothers, take the barn. Martinez, you're with me. We're going to have a polite conversation with our host. He checked the stolen revolver one last time. Remember, we need supplies and fresh horses more than we need blood. But if this old-timer decides to be a hero, he left the threat unfinished. His men knew what to do. What none of them realized, as they prepared their assault on the quiet ranch, was that fate had played a cosmic joke. Of all the properties in all of Texas, they had chosen the home of the one man they should have avoided at all costs. As the sunset behind them, casting long shadows across the prairie, 6 desperate outlaws prepared to make the last mistake of their lives. The sun had just touched the horizon when McCall sensed the first signs of intrusion. It wasn't anything obvious, just the sudden silence of prairie birds near the north fence, the way his cattle had gradually shifted toward the southern pasture. Nature's warning system, speaking to those who knew how to listen. He continued his evening routine, apparently absorbed in securing the barn doors, but his senses remained razor-sharp. The crack of a twig, barely audible, came from behind the water trough. Another slight movement caught his eye near the storage shed. They were trying to surround him, whoever they were, and doing a decent job of it. For amateurs. Evening, a voice called out, casual but carrying an edge of menace. 2 men emerged from the growing shadows, approaching with measured steps. The older one, clearly the leader, wore a stolen guard's gun belt. His companion moved with military precision. Cavalry, McCall guessed, noting the distinctive way he balanced his weight. Mighty fine spread you got here, the leader continued, stopping just beyond the barn's shadow. Name's Marcus Cole. My friends and I have been riding hard. Could use a bit of hospitality. McCall's voice remained steady, betraying none of the tension coursing through his body. Most folks introduce themselves before bringing friends to call. His eyes tracked the shadows behind his visitors, counting the shapes, trying to stay hidden. 4 more, 6 total, just as the sheriff had warned. Cole's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just some tired travelers, friend. Looking to water our horses, maybe trade for supplies. His hand rested casually near his stolen revolver. We're willing to pay, of course. Trading posts in town, McCall replied evenly. 5 miles east. Can't miss it. His own hand hadn't moved toward his gun, but he'd shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his balance. Old instincts, rising to the surface like sharks scenting blood. A younger man, barely more than a boy, emerged from behind the storage shed, too nervous to maintain his hiding spot. "Cole, we don't have time for—" "Shut up, Billy!" Cole's sharp command revealed the first crack in his confident facade. He turned back to McCall, the pretense of friendliness fading. "Look, old-timer, this can go easy or hard. We need horses, supplies, and whatever cash you got stashed away. You help us out, you get to keep breathing. Simple as that." McCall's eyes, hard as gunmetal, met Cole's. Nothing simple about it. His voice carried a new tone, something that made Cole's trigger finger twitch involuntarily. "Last chance to ride away. Won't offer twice." Snake Eyes Cooper, hidden behind the water trough, had heard enough. His derringer barked once, the shot aimed at McCall's chest. But the rancher was no longer there, having moved with impossible speed at the first hint of the draw. McCall's Colt seemed to materialize in his hand, its report thundering across the yard. Cooper screamed, his derringer flying into the dust. Along with two of his fingers, the speed of the draw, the precision of the shot. Cole's blood ran cold as recognition dawned. "Sweet Jesus," Billy Thompson whispered, terror cracking his voice. That's Shadowhand McCall." Martinez, the ex-cavalry scout, was already diving for cover. "Cole, that's John McCall, the gunfighter from Dodge. Back off, all of you." Cole's shout carried the edge of panic now. "Back to the horses!" "Now!" They retreated in chaos, dragging the wounded Cooper with them. McCall's voice followed them into the gathering darkness. "Don't come back. Next time won't be a warning shot." As the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded, McCall surveyed his yard with practiced eyes. They'd be back. Men like that, with nowhere else to go, always came back. He'd given them a chance, honored his promise to Sarah as best he could. But as he collected Cooper's dropped derringer, he knew the real violence was still to come. The weight of his Colt felt familiar in his hand, like greeting an old friend he'd hoped never to see again. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled, a sound caught between hunger and mourning. The night was just beginning. McCall stood in his darkening yard, the last rays of sunlight painting long shadows across the dusty ground. Cooper's blood stained the dirt near the water trough, a stark reminder that 30 years of peace had just been shattered. He holstered his Colt slowly, each movement deliberate, fighting the familiar rush that came with gunplay. Inside the house, he lit a lamp and moved with purpose. From beneath a loose floorboard under Sarah's rocking chair, he retrieved a wooden box he hadn't opened in decades. The brass hinges creaked in protest as he lifted the lid, revealing old newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Shadowhand claims 5 in Dodge City. Lightning draw leaves 7 dead. Memories preserved in printer's ink. But it was the small book beneath the clippings that held his attention. A leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with names. Every man he'd ever killed. 43 names, each one written in his careful hand. He'd started the practice young, determined never to forget the weight of taking a life. Sarah had found the book once, early in their marriage. "Why do you keep it?" she'd asked, her voice soft in the lamplight. "To remember they were men," he'd answered, "not just notches on a gun." A sound from outside pulled him from the memory. Moving to the window, he watched the escaped convicts regrouping in the distance, their forms barely visible in the gathering. Gloom. They'd found shelter in the old Carson Canyon, about a half-mile out, close enough to plan their next move, far enough to feel safe. They weren't. McCall knew what came next. Men like Cole, backed into a corner, would only grow more desperate, more dangerous. The smart play would be to end it now, use his skills while they were still disorganized. But Sarah's voice echoed in his mind. "Violence begets violence, John. There's always another way." He moved to his gun cabinet, removing a Winchester rifle, not the weapon of a gunfighter. This was a rancher's tool, meant for wolves and coyotes. Loading it deliberately, he walked out to his horse. Bell nickered softly as he mounted, familiar with night rides. The quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate the familiar terrain. McCall rode slowly, making no attempt to mask his approach. When he reached speaking distance of the canyon, he heard the metallic click of weapons being readied. "Cole!" His voice carried across the darkness. "I know you're in there. Listen carefully." Silence answered him, but he knew they were listening. "I've killed 43 men." McCall's words fell like stones in still water. Each one thought he was faster, smarter, or more desperate than the rest. Each one was wrong. "I've spent 30 years trying to forget what it feels like to end a man's life. Don't make me remember." He could hear them muttering among themselves. The wounded Cooper's pained breathing punctuating the night air. "There's a doctor in Willow Creek, 5 miles east. Get your man there, then keep riding. You've got 1 hour before I inform the sheriff. After that, all bets are off." From the darkness, Cole's voice emerged, strained but defiant. "You're not as young as you used to be, McCall. There's 6 of us. Even Shadowhand can't beat those odds." 43 men, McCall repeated quietly. "Some alone, some in groups. Numbers didn't help them any." He turned Bell around, silhouetted against the starlit sky. 1 hour. Don't waste it." As he rode back toward his ranch, McCall felt the weight of his gun like a judgment. He'd offered mercy, knowing they wouldn't take it. Men like that never did. The last light faded from the western sky, and with it, his last hope of keeping his promise to Sarah. Sometimes, he reflected, peace wasn't a choice you got to make. Sometimes it was stolen from you by men who understood only the language of violence. And in that language, John Shadowhand McCall was still terrifyingly fluent. McCall stood before Sarah's daguerreotype in the soft lamplight, his weathered fingers tracing the edge of the silver frame. "I tried, Sarah," he whispered. "God knows I tried." Turning away from her frozen smile, he moved with renewed purpose. Toward the bedroom, the floorboards creaked under the old carpet as he knelt, removing a hidden panel he hadn't touched in 3 decades. The leather gun belt inside still gleamed with regular oiling. Maintenance had been the one gunfighter's habit he'd never abandoned. 2 custom Colts nestled in their holsters, mirror images of the working gun he wore daily. These weren't ranching tools, they were instruments of death, crafted specifically for speed and accuracy. As he buckled on the familiar rig, muscle memory took over. The weight settled differently than his everyday belt. These holsters rode lower, canted for the cross draw that had made him famous. The second gun, positioned for his left hand, had been his signature. No one expected a man to be equally deadly with both hands. In the barn, he found his old saddlebags, still stiff with disuse. The interior pockets held extra ammunition, carefully wrapped and preserved. He'd always been methodical about preparation. It was part of what had kept him alive when others died. The barn's hidden loft revealed more supplies. Medical supplies, extra weapons, emergency provisions. Even in peace, he'd maintained his fallback positions. Moving through the ranch house, McCall began implementing the defensive strategy he'd planned decades ago when he first bought the property. He'd chosen this land not just for its isolation, but for its tactical advantages. The approaching ravine that provided the only easy access to the ranch house, the natural bottlenecks, the elevated positions that commanded clear fields of fire. In the root cellar, he shifted old preserves aside to reveal a cache of mining explosives, legally purchased for clearing stumps, but never used. The ranch's design suddenly revealed its deeper purpose. It wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. Every fence line provided cover, every outbuilding positioned to create crossfire zones. "You always knew this day might come," he murmured to himself, remembering how he'd insisted on certain architectural choices that Sarah had found peculiar. The extra thick walls, the reinforced shutters, the strategic placement of windows. He'd built their home like a man expecting war, all while praying for peace. At his workbench, McCall began loading ammunition with the precision of a surgeon. Each bullet was hand-checked, each load measured exactly. No room for error. Not in this. Game. His hands moved through the familiar routine without conscious thought, while his mind calculated angles, distances, and probabilities. The hour he'd given the outlaws was nearly up. They wouldn't have taken his warning. Men like that never did. Cole's type especially, proud, desperate, with nothing left to lose. They'd come at night, thinking darkness would give them the advantage. They didn't know that some of his most lethal work had been done under starlight. A soft wind whispered through the ranch house windows, carrying the scent of sage and approaching rain. McCall paused in his preparations, remembering another night, like this 30 years ago. The night he'd made his promise to Sarah. No more killing, he'd said then, no more violence. But as he'd learned in a lifetime of hard choices, sometimes keeping one promise meant breaking another. He'd promised to protect this land too, to be a good neighbor to the folks in Willow Creek. If Cole and his men escaped tonight, they'd bring their violence to other homes, other families. Moving to the porch, McCall surveyed his property in the fading light. The setting sun painted the clouds crimson, nature's warning of blood to come. He'd given them their chance to walk away. Now there would be consequences. Inside, he lit lanterns and positioned them carefully, not where they'd illuminate him, but where their light would blind anyone looking in from outside. Each window became a potential firing position, each door a possible ambush point. The ranch house transformed from a home into a killing ground. Finally, McCall returned to Sarah's photograph. "Forgive me, love," he said softly, "but some debts can only be paid in blood." The guns rode naturally at his hips now, as if the past 30 years had been the dream, and this was his true reality. The sun dipped below the horizon, and John Shadowhand. McCall felt the mantle of his old reputation settle onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. By morning, there would be new names for his ledger. The only question was how many. Marcus Cole crouched in the shadows of Carson Canyon, watching Snake Eyes Cooper writhe in pain. The makeshift bandage around the gambler's mangled hand had soaked through, and his face had taken on an unhealthy pallor. Behind him, the Webster. Brothers argued in harsh whispers while Billy Thompson kept watch. "Shadowhand McCall," Martinez muttered, shaking his head. "I should have recognized the way he moved. My old sergeant used to tell stories about him, said he once took down 15 men in a factory in St. Louis. Killed them all without reloading." "Fairy tales," Frank Webster spat, but his voice trembled. "No man's that fast. You saw what he did to Snake Eyes," Billy countered. "Never even saw him draw. Just bang, like lightning." Cole pulled out the worn wanted poster he'd taken from the prison guard's body. In the fading light, he could barely make out the faces of other notorious outlaws. Then he found it, tucked in the middle, a yellowed newspaper clipping about the Tombstone massacre. "Listen to this," he said, his voice tight. "John Shadowhand McCall, the notorious gunfighter, killed 5 members of the Bannister gang in Tombstone today. Witnesses report the entire gunfight lasted less than 3 seconds. McCall is believed to have killed over 40 men in his career, though exact numbers remain disputed." Cooper groaned from his position against the canyon wall. "We gotta get out of here, Cole. Man like that. He won't let us walk away now." "Shut up." Cole's whisper was fierce. "I ain't running from one old man. There's 6 of us, for Christ's sake." "5 now," Martinez corrected, nodding at Cooper's useless hand. "And he's got the high ground, knows the territory, probably has firing positions set up all over that ranch." A sound echoed through the darkness, the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. Everyone froze. "Too late for running now, Tom," Webster whispered. The rifle shot cracked through the night like thunder. Frank Webster screamed as his hat flew off, a neat hole punched through its crown. The message was clear. McCall could have killed him if he'd wanted to. "That's a Winchester," Martinez said, his cavalry training showing. 800 yards at least. In the dark. The fear in his voice was unmistakable now. Cole's mind raced. They couldn't stay in the canyon. They were trapped here. But leaving cover meant exposing themselves to that deadly rifle. The stories about McCall's skill suddenly seemed less like legend and more like warning. Another shot rang out, this one striking their water canteen, sending precious liquid spilling into the dust. Their horses, already nervous, began to stamp and whinny. "He's playing with us," Billy said, his young face pale in the moonlight, like a cat with mice. As if to prove his point, 3 rapid shots followed. Each one struck a different piece of their equipment, a saddlebag, a powder horn, a spare rifle. The precision was terrifying. No random firing, no wasted bullets. Each shot a demonstration of deadly skill. "The stories," Martinez continued, his voice hollow. "They say he once held off 30 men at Adobe Wells, killed 18 before the rest ran. They called him El Ángel de la Muerte, the Angel of Death." New sound cut through the night, the rhythmic creaking of a rocking chair from the direction of McCall's front porch. The old gunfighter was sitting in plain view, silhouetted against the lamplight from his window. A ghost story come to life. "We got no choice," Cole decided, desperation edging into his voice. "We go now, hit him hard, all at once. No man can shoot all of us." But as they prepared to move, Billy Thompson grabbed Cole's arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the ridge behind the house. There, outlined against the stars, stood McCall's horse. But the saddle was empty. The realization hit them all at once. The man on the porch was a dummy, positioned to draw their attention, which meant the real McCall was out there in the darkness, hunting them. Snake eyes. Cooper began to sob quietly, the sound carrying in the still night air. None of his companions moved to quiet him. They were all thinking the same thing. They hadn't found shelter in this canyon. They'd walked into a trap. The night grew deeper as clouds rolled in, obscuring the quarter moon. In the darkness, Martinez was the first to notice their horses had gone quiet. Too quiet. He'd spent enough time in Apache country to recognize the silence of prey animals. Sensing a predator, "Cole," he whispered urgently. "The horses!" A soft thud interrupted him, followed by the sound of retreating hoofbeats. Their tethered mounts, spooked by an unseen presence, had broken free and were now scattered across the prairie. McCall had cut their reins from the shadows, eliminating their means of escape. "Spread out," Cole ordered, his voice barely audible. "Back to back. He can't take us all at once." The outlaws formed a rough circle, weapons drawn, each man scanning the darkness. The clouds parted briefly, moonlight casting strange shadows across the canyon walls. Every bush, every rock could be hiding their hunter. A metallic click echoed from above. Frank Webster looked up just in time to see a small object tumbling down the canyon wall. "Dynamite!" he screamed, diving for cover. The explosion wasn't large, but in the confined space of the canyon, it was devastating. Rocks and debris rained down, forcing the group to scatter. Through the dust and confusion, McCall struck. 2 shots rang out, so close together they sounded like a single report. Tom Webster felt his gun hand explode in pain as his revolver went spinning into the darkness. Beside him, his brother Frank clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Jesus Christ!" Billy Thompson's voice cracked with panic. "He's using both hands." Martinez recognized the technique instantly. El Trueno Gemelo, the twin thunder. "They say he's the only man alive who can shoot equally well with both hands." "Shut up about the stories," Cole roared, but fear had crept in too. His voice. "Snake eyes, Thompson. Head for the ridge. Martinez, cover them. Webster brothers with me. We're ending this now." But as the group tried to split up, McCall's voice carried through the darkness. 43 men made the same mistake you're making now." His words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Breaking up just makes it easier." Another explosion, smaller this time, drove Snake Eyes and Thompson away from the ridge. They stumbled straight into Martinez, who had turned. At the sound, in the confusion, none of them saw the shadow that moved behind them. Martinez felt cold steel press against his neck. "Drop it!" McCall's voice commanded. The ex-cavalry scout's gun fell instantly to the dirt. Now, McCall continued, you're going to walk straight ahead. 10 paces. Don't run. He paused. Running just makes the bullet hurt more. Martinez walked, counting steps, his heart thundering. At 8 he heard the gunshot. Something hot grazed his left ear, and he fell, clutching the shallow wound. A warning shot, delivered with surgical precision. 1, McCall called out, his voice carrying to the remaining outlaws. Who's next? Snake Eyes. Cooper broke first. The pain from his mangled hand and the terror of the situation proved too much. He sprinted for the canyon entrance, ignoring Cole's shouts to stop. 2 shots cracked through the night. Cooper's hat flew off with the first. The second struck his boot heel, sending him sprawling. He lay there sobbing as McCall's voice drifted down. 2. The remaining outlaws pressed themselves against the canyon walls, trying to disappear into the shadows. But they could feel McCall's presence all around them, an invisible noose slowly tightening. Billy Thompson, the youngest of the group, began to pray quietly. The Webster brothers, both wounded now, huddled together behind a boulder. Cole, alone, maintained his defiance, but his hand shook as he reloaded his revolver. Above them all, moving like a ghost through the darkness, John McCall continued his hunt. The night was still young, and he had many lessons yet to teach about the true meaning of fear. A distant rumble of wagon wheels caught Cole's attention through the chaos. His eyes, adjusted to the darkness, caught the faint glow of a lantern moving along the main road. Some fool heading to or from Willow Creek, unaware of the hell they were about to stumble into. "Billy," Cole whispered urgently. "The road, now!" It was their only chance. McCall wouldn't risk innocent lives. Not if the stories about him were true. Billy Thompson crawled through the brush, using the sound of the Webster brothers' pained breathing to cover his movement. He'd barely made it 10 yards when McCall's voice cut through the night. "That's far enough, boy." But for once, the legendary gunfighter had miscalculated. The wagon was closer than he'd realized, and Billy was faster than anyone expected. The young outlaw burst from cover, sprinting toward the road with reckless speed. The wagon's driver, an elderly man named Peterson, never saw Billy coming. One moment he was guiding his horses through the dark, his wife Martha dozing beside him. The next, he was staring down the barrel of a stolen prison revolver. "Stop the wagon!" Billy's voice cracked with desperation. "Stop, or I swear to God I'll kill you both." Cole emerged from the shadows, followed by the Webster brothers, Martinez, and Snake Eyes remained behind, both too wounded to move quickly. The old couple froze as 4 armed men surrounded their wagon. "Mr. McCall!" Cole shouted into the darkness. "Things have changed. Come out where we can see you, or these good folks die messy." For a long moment, only silence answered. Then McCall's voice, calm as still water. "You really want to add murder of innocents to your charges, Cole?" "Rather add it to my charges than to my conscience," Cole shot back. "Throw out your guns, all of them. Then walk out slow, hands high." Martha Peterson began to cry softly. Her husband reached for her hand, his weathered face tight with fear. They were simple farmers, caught in a deadly game between killers. 10 seconds, McCall. Cole pressed his gun against Martha's temple. 10 seconds before... The shot seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Cole's gun disappeared from his, hand torn away with surgical precision. Before he could react, 2 more shots rang out. The Webster brothers dropped their weapons, crying out as bullets grazed their already wounded arms. Only Billy still held a gun, his arm trembling around Peterson's neck. "Stay back!" he screamed. "I'll do it! I swear I'll—" "Look at your feet, son!" McCall's voice was almost gentle. Billy looked down. A small stick of dynamite, fuse burning, lay in the dust beside him. "That fuse is 12 seconds, McCall continued. 10 seconds now, just long enough to make a choice. Drop the gun and run, or die a stupid death." "He's bluffing," Cole shouted. "He wouldn't risk the—" Billy wasn't listening. He shoved Peterson away and bolted into the darkness. The old couple huddled together as Cole and the Websters stared at the burning fuse, paralyzed with indecision. 8 seconds. 7. 6. They ran. The explosion was small, controlled, a blast designed to terrify rather than kill. When the dust settled, the Petersons' wagon was untouched, but the outlaws had scattered like leaves in a storm. McCall materialized from the shadows, moving with liquid grace. "Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Peterson, my apologies for your fright. If you'll allow me, I'll escort you into town." "John McCall," Peterson breathed, recognition dawning. "The stories, they're true then?" "Some of them." McCall helped Martha down from the wagon. "But right now, what matters is getting you folks to safety." Then his eyes tracked movement in the darkness. "Then I'll finish what these men started." As he led the wagon toward town, McCall knew he'd lost his tactical advantage. The outlaws were scattered now, desperate, more dangerous than ever, but they'd crossed a line, threatening innocence, and that had just signed their death warrant. Behind. To them, Cole gathered his remaining men, fury replacing fear. "He has to go to town now," he snarled. "Has to play the hero when he comes back." He checked his backup revolver. "When he comes back, we'll be ready." But in the distance, thunder rolled across the prairie. A storm was coming, and in the darkness, no one could tell if it was nature's fury or the wrath of a legend reborn. The storm rolled closer as McCall guided the Petersons' wagon into Willow Creek. Sheriff Bradley was already waiting outside the jail, roused by the distant explosions. His face hardened at the sight of Martha Peterson's tear-streaked cheeks. "John," Bradley nodded, helping the couple down. "Looks like your past caught up with you." "Not my past," McCall replied, but something nagged at his memory. Something about Cole's face that seemed familiar. "Get them inside. Storm's coming, and not just the one in the sky." As the sheriff led the Petersons to safety, McCall noticed movement in the shadows beside the general store. His guns appeared in his hands instantly, but it was only Billy Thompson. Weaponless, hands raised. "Don't shoot!" The young outlaw's voice trembled. "Please, I need to tell you something about Cole." McCall kept his guns trained steady. "Talk. He knew about your ranch. Planned this whole thing." Billy's words tumbled out in a rush. "Said his pa told him stories about you, about what happened in Tombstone." The memory hit McCall like a physical blow. Cole. Marcus Cole. The name. Finally connected. He'd seen those same eyes 30 years ago in a younger face. "James Cole's boy," he whispered. "His pa was with the Bannister gang," Billy continued. "The only one who got away that day. Raised Marcus on stories about you, filled him with hate, said you didn't give them a chance to surrender, just killed them all in cold blood." McCall's mind raced back to that Sunday morning in Tombstone. The mayor's daughter held hostage, 5 men dead in 3 seconds, but there had been a 6th man, one who'd run when the shooting started, leaving his companions to die. "Your pa lied, boy," McCall said quietly. "They had a child hostage, Elizabeth Martinez, 12 years old." Thunder cracked overhead as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Billy's eyes widened with understanding. "Martinez. Our Martinez. The cavalry scout? Her brother." McCall's voice was grim. "Which means Cole's been lying to him too, using him." A shot rang out from the darkness. Billy jerked and fell, blood blooming on his chest. Cole's voice followed. "Shouldn't talk to the enemy, kid." McCall dove for cover as more shots peppered the street. He caught a glimpse of Cole on the roof of the livery stable, the Webster brothers taking position behind rain barrels across the street. Snake Eyes and Martinez were nowhere to be seen. 30 years, McCall," Cole shouted over the growing storm. 30 years my pa told me about you. How you gunned down good men without warning. How you built your legend on quick triggers and fancy shooting. Your pa was a coward," McCall called back. "He held a gun to a child's head, then ran while his friends died. Liar!" But there was doubt in Cole's voice now. "Martinez, you hear that? Your sister was there?" Silence answered him. Martinez had vanished into the rain-soaked night. The revelation of Cole's deception had shattered whatever loyalty remained among the outlaws. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the street in stark white. In that frozen moment, McCall saw everything: Cole's position, the Webster brothers' nervous glances, and most importantly, the look of desperate madness in Cole's eyes. This was no longer about escape or survival. This was about revenge, about a son trying to fulfill a father's twisted legacy. "Your pa spent 30 years poisoning your mind," McCall said, his voice carrying over the storm. "Told you I was a cold-blooded killer. Truth is, I gave them every chance to surrender, to let that girl go. They chose wrong. Shut up." Cole's shot went wide, emotions spoiling his aim. "You're dead, McCall, you hear me? Dead!" But McCall wasn't listening anymore. His mind was already calculating angles, distances, probabilities. The rain would make the roof slick, affect bullet trajectories. The Webster brothers were injured, their nerves shot. And Cole was operating on pure hatred now, his judgment clouded by a lifetime of lies. Lightning flashed again, and McCall made his move. The time for talk was over. James Cole had started this blood feud 30 years ago in Tombstone. Now his son would end it one way or another in the rain-swept streets of Willow Creek. Behind them, Billy Thompson gasped his last breath, another victim of a vendetta born in lies and nursed by hatred. The storm raged on, nature's fury matching the violence about to explode in the darkness below. Rain hammered the streets of Willow Creek as McCall pressed himself against the wet adobe wall of the general store. Behind him, Sheriff Bradley was organizing the townspeople, getting them to safety in the sturdy stone church. Through the downpour, McCall caught glimpses of Cole's men taking positions around the town square. "Just like your pa," McCall called out, his voice carrying over the storm. "Putting innocent folks in danger. Some legacies ain't worth keeping, boy." A bullet splintered the wood beside his head. Cole's answer was clear enough. Inside the sheriff's office, Martha Peterson's sobs mingled with the thunder. Her husband's voice carried through the window. "Ain't right, Sheriff. Man spends 30 years trying to live peaceful, and trouble finds him anyway." McCall's mind flashed to Sarah's grave on the hill behind their ranch. She'd said something similar once, about how violence had a way of echoing through time. Now here was the proof. A son carrying his father's hatred like a sacred torch, ready to burn everything down for revenge. Lightning illuminated the street, and McCall caught sight of Martinez slipping between buildings, heading away from Cole's position. The revelation about his sister had shaken the ex-cavalry scout's loyalty. One less gun to worry about, but Cole was still dangerous, maybe more dangerous now that he was cornered. The Webster brothers had taken cover behind the overturned wagon they'd shot Billy from, their wounds making them sloppy. Through the rain, McCall could see Frank fumbling to reload, his injured shoulder hampering his movements. Tom's gun hand was still bleeding, his shots going wild when he did fire. "You can still walk away from this," McCall shouted. "Your pa had 30 years to confine me himself, chose to poison you with lies instead. Don't die for his cowardice." Cole's answer was another volley of shots. One struck the church bell, sending a discordant ring through the storm. "Only one dying tonight is you, McCall. Then everyone'll know the truth about the great Shadowhand, just another killer who got lucky." Thunder crashed overhead as McCall formulated his plan. The rain had made the roof tiles slick. Cole would have trouble maintaining his position up there. The Webster brothers were more liability than help now. If he could separate them, a scream cut through the night. Snake Eyes Cooper had tried to make a break for the stables and caught a bullet from Cole for his trouble. The gambler lay writhing in the mud, his already wounded hand now matched by a shot through his leg. "Your own man, Cole!" McCall's disgust was evident. "That what your pa taught you about loyalty?" For a moment, doubt crept into Cole's voice. "He was running, just like they all run when things get hard." McCall moved like a shadow through the rain, working his way around the edge of the square. "Like your pa ran in Tombstone, leaving 5 men to die while he saved himself?" The Webster brothers exchanged glances. They could see what McCall already knew. Cole was unraveling, his lifelong vendetta crumbling as truth eroded the foundation of lies it was built on. Tom! Frank! Cole's voice carried an edge of desperation now. Get to the other side! Cut off his escape! But the brothers hesitated, their own survival instinct finally overriding their loyalty to a madman. They'd seen too much tonight. The casual shooting of Billy, the wounding of Cooper. This wasn't the escape plan they'd signed up for. Lightning flashed again, and McCall made his move. 2 shots rang out, precise despite the rain. The Webster brothers' remaining guns went spinning into the mud, along with any fight they had left in them. It's over, Cole. McCall's voice was steel in the storm. Your men are down or gone. Even Martinez figured out you've been lying to him. Just like your pa lied to you. Cole's answering laugh held the edge of madness. It's not over till one of us is dead, old man. You or me, just like it should have been my pa 30 years ago. The rain continued to pour as McCall realized the truth. There would be no talking Cole down. Some wounds ran too deep, some hatreds burned too bright. The son would have to pay for the father's sins, one way or another. Have it your way, McCall said softly, more to himself than to Cole. Sarah would understand. Sometimes peace could only be bought with blood. McCall moved through the rain like a ghost, each step calculated. The storm had turned Willow Creek's main street into a river of mud, but he knew every board, every nail, every creaking step in town. 30 years of peaceful Sunday visits had given him an intimacy with the terrain that Cole couldn't match. From his new position behind the saloon, McCall could see it all clearly. Cole was getting desperate on his perch, the rain-slicked roof making his position increasingly precarious. The Webster brothers had retreated to the shadow of the general store, more concerned with their wounds than the fight. Snake Eyes Cooper lay moaning in the mud, while Martinez had vanished completely. "Sheriff," McCall called softly, knowing Bradley could hear him through the jail window. "When I make my move, get everyone in the church basement, no matter what. You hear?" "John," Bradley's voice was equally low. "You sure about this? Man's got murder in his eyes, just like his pa." McCall checked his guns with practiced hands. Something's gotta end where they started. The rain drummed a steady rhythm on the wooden sidewalks as McCall implemented his plan. First, he used his belt knife to cut loose the hitching post in front of the saloon. The heavy wood made a satisfying splash as it toppled into the mud. Cole's shot was immediate, giving away his sightlines. Perfect. Next, McCall pulled a small package from his coat, his last stick of dynamite wrapped in oilcloth to keep it dry. With deliberate care, he set it behind an empty barrel, making sure Cole could see the movement. "Getting predictable, old man," Cole's voice carried over the storm. "Already used that trick." McCall smiled in the darkness. The boy had his pa's arrogance too. Lightning split the sky as McCall made his way to the undertaker's shop. Old Gus kept a ladder there, used for maintaining the high windows. In the brief illumination, McCall saw Martinez watching from an alley, his military training evident in how he stayed in the shadows. Their eyes met, and an understanding passed between them. "Your sister, Elizabeth," McCall said quietly, knowing Martinez could hear. "She became a schoolteacher, still lives in Tombstone, never forgot the man who saved her life." Martinez's silhouette remained still for a long moment. Then he melted away into the night, taking his gun and his loyalty with him. Running out of "Friends, Cole!" McCall's voice boomed across the square. "Just like your pa in Tombstone, left alone when the killing started." "Shut up about my pa." Cole's shots went wild, splashing into puddles. "You're nothing but a killer who got lucky. A legend built on lies. Only lies here are the ones you've been living with." McCall moved the ladder carefully, positioning it against the saloon wall. The noise would draw Cole's attention exactly where he wanted it. Right on cue, Cole's gun barked again. McCall had already moved, but now Cole was focused on the saloon's roof, expecting McCall to try climbing up. The Webster brothers saw their chance and took it, dropping their guns and raising their hands. "We surrender!" Tom's voice shook. "Don't shoot!" Sheriff Bradley emerged briefly to take them into custody, then disappeared back into the jail. The square was empty now, except for McCall, Cole, and the rain. "Just you and me now, boy," McCall called out, "like you wanted. But I'm giving you one last chance, more than your pa ever gave that little girl. Walk away. Go see Elizabeth Martinez. Ask her what really happened that day." Cole's answer was another shot, closer this time. His rage was making him sloppy, burning away the last of his judgment, just as McCall had planned, because while Cole was watching the ladder, watching the dynamite, watching all the obvious threats, he'd missed the real danger. The rain had soaked through the old roof tiles, weakening them, and Cole was standing right where McCall needed him. 30 years of peace, McCall whispered to himself, touching the grip of his gun. "Hope you understand, Sarah." Thunder rolled across Willow Creek as McCall prepared to spring his trap. The story that began in Tombstone with a father's cowardice would end here in the rain with a son's final choice. The rain fell in silver sheets as McCall made his move. His first shot wasn't aimed at Cole, but at the roof tiles just above him, a precise strike that sent a cascade of broken clay skittering down the slick surface. Cole scrambled for balance, cursing as his boots lost purchase on the wet roof. "That the best you got, old man?" Cole's voice cracked with desperate bravado. "Trying to make me slip and fall?" McCall's answer was 2 more shots, methodically destroying Cole's cover. Each bullet found its mark with surgical precision, splintering the wooden support beams Cole had been using for protection. The younger man was forced to retreat, moving exactly where McCall wanted him. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark flashes. Cole inching along the roof ridge, McCall moving like a shadow through the rain-swept streets below. Their deadly dance had drawn an audience. Faces peered cautiously from windows and doorways, watching legend come to life. "Your pa ever tell you what really happened that day?" McCall's voice carried over the storm. How he held that little girl in front of him like a shield? How she begged him not to hurt her? Cole's response was a wild volley of shots that lit up the night. "Liar! He told me everything! How you gunned them down without warning! How you—" His words cut off as one of the roof tiles gave way beneath him. Cole slid several feet before catching himself, but not before dropping his spare ammunition pouch. It landed in the mud with a wet splash, leaving him with only the bullets in his gun. McCall moved with liquid grace, years falling away as muscle memory took over. His gun seemed to materialize in his hands as he spun around the corner of the saloon, firing twice. The first shot knocked Cole's hat off. The second creased his arm, drawing blood. 6 shots left in that revolver, McCall called out. "Make them count, boy. More than your pa managed." Cole's answering shot went wide, but his next one came closer, splintering the wood near McCall's head. 8 good men died because of you. 8 friends my pa had to watch you murder. 5 men, McCall corrected, his voice hard as steel. 5. Killers who chose their pride over a child's life. Your pa wasn't there to watch. He was running away, leaving his friends to die, just like you left Billy Thompson bleeding in the street. The words hit Cole harder than any bullet. His next shot went wild, emotion ruining his aim. "Shut up, just shut up and die." But McCall was moving again, each step deliberate. The dynamite he'd planted earlier suddenly sparked to life, its fuse sputtering in the rain. Cole's attention jerked toward it, just as McCall had planned. The explosion was small, controlled, but it served its purpose. Cole instinctively scrambled away from the blast, putting him right where McCall needed him. The weakened roof tiles creaked ominously under his weight. 4 shots left, McCall counted calmly. Your pa had the same number when he put a gun to Elizabeth Martinez's head. Want to know the difference between you and him? Cole fired twice more, his bullets whining past McCall's head. I said shut up about my pa. The difference is he was smart enough to run. McCall's guns roared in unison, the twin thunder that had made him legendary. One bullet shattered the roof tile under Cole's left foot. The other severed the rain gutter he'd been gripping. Time seemed to slow as Cole lost his balance. His last 2 shots echoed uselessly in the night as he slid down the roof, desperately scrabbling for purchase on the wet tiles. His face, illuminated by another flash of lightning, showed the same fear his fathers had worn 30 years ago in Tombstone, the look of a man realizing too late that he'd made a terrible mistake. Cole hit the ground hard, landing in the mud beside Snake Eyes Cooper's unconscious form. His gun flew from his grip, disappearing into a rain-filled puddle. Lightning flashed again, revealing McCall standing over him, both revolvers trained. "Steady despite the storm. This is how it ended in Tombstone too," McCall said quietly. "Good men dead because of pride and lies. Only difference is, your pa wasn't there to see it. He was halfway to Mexico, leaving his friends to face what he'd started." Cole spat mud and blood, his eyes wild with desperate fury. His hand crept towards Snake Eyes' dropped derringer, hidden in the muck beside him. "You're lying. He told me everything, how you murdered them all without mercy, without giving them a chance." McCall's voice cut through the rain. "I gave them 3 chances to let Elizabeth go. Your pa was the one who said they'd kill her if I didn't throw down my guns." His eyes, hard as gunmetal, locked onto Cole's. "I've got witnesses still living. Elizabeth Martinez herself. Your pa spent 30 years running from the truth, and he raised you to do the same." Cole's fingers found the derringer's grip. "My pa was a good man. Your pa was a coward who got 5 men killed. Just like you got Billy Thompson killed, just like you shot Snake Eyes for running." McCall hadn't moved, but his presence seemed to fill the entire street. "Now you've got one last choice to make. Better make it a smarter one than your pa did." Thunder crashed overhead as Cole made his decision. The derringer came up, slick with mud and rain, but before he could aim, before his finger could tighten on the trigger, McCall's guns roared one final time. The twin thunder, they'd called it in the old days. 2 shots so perfectly synchronized they sounded like one. Cole's derringer went spinning away, along with any chance of continuing his father's. "Vendetta! You could have killed me," Cole whispered, staring at his bleeding hand, wounded in almost the same spot as Snake Eyes. "Why didn't you?" "Because I'm not the cold-blooded killer your pa made me out to be." McCall holstered one gun, keeping the other trained on Cole. "Never was. Every man I killed made his choice, just like you made yours." Sheriff Bradley emerged from the jail, followed by his deputies. They moved quickly to secure Cole and tend to Snake Eyes. The rain was finally beginning to slack, the storm passing as quickly as it had arrived. "John," Bradley said softly, looking at his old friend, "what you said about Elizabeth Martinez, about witnesses, that true?" McCall nodded. "Every word. Might be time the real story was told." He looked at Cole, who seemed to have aged years. In the past few minutes might help some folks finally let go of old lies. As they led Cole away, he turned back one last time. "My pa, did he ever come close to facing you again?" "Once," McCall admitted. "About 20 years back, he rode into my ranch, drunk and full of courage. We talked instead of shooting. I told him where to find Elizabeth, told him to ask her what really happened." He paused, remembering. "He rode away instead. Some men prefer comfortable lies to hard truths." The townspeople began emerging from the church basement, drawn by the sudden quiet. They found their main street littered with spent shells and broken clay tiles, 6 notorious escapees captured or wounded, and John McCall, the legend they'd lived beside for 30 years, standing peaceful in the fading rain. "You'll have to testify," Bradley said. "Tell the whole story this time." McCall nodded, already thinking of Sarah's grave on the hill. She'd understand why he'd broken his promise of peace. Some ghosts could only be laid to rest by facing them. "Head on. Reckon it's time," he said quietly. "Past time, maybe." The storm's last rumbles faded into the distance as dawn began to paint the eastern sky. 30 years of quiet had ended in a single violent night. But as McCall looked toward his ranch and the life he'd built there, he knew his peace hadn't been destroyed. It had been defended. Sometimes that's what peace required. Not just the strength to keep promises, but the wisdom to know when breaking them was the only right choice. Dawn broke over Willow Creek, painting the rain-washed streets in shades of gold. Doc Wilson had his hands full tending to the wounded, Snake Eyes, Cooper's mangled hand and leg, the Webster brothers' various injuries, and Cole's final wounds. Billy Thompson's body lay covered in the undertaker's shop, another victim of lies and desperate choices. McCall stood on the jail's porch, watching as Martinez rode away toward Tombstone. The ex-cavalry scout had asked for his sister's address, 30 years of mystery finally unraveling. His departure marked the last loose end of a night that had changed everything. "Town's going to talk about this for years," Sheriff Bradley said, joining him. "Legend of Shadowhand McCall just got bigger." McCall shook his head. "Not if I can help it. Had enough of legends." He looked toward his ranch where his quiet life waited. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that don't get told. The next morning found McCall at Sarah's grave, the first rays of sunlight warming the simple headstone. He'd spent an hour cleaning away the mud and debris left by the storm, just as he'd done every week for 15 years. His guns, cleaned and oiled, rode on his hips, a weight he knew he'd never fully set aside again. "Had to break my promise," he said softly to the stone, "but I kept the most important one, still the man you helped me become, still choosing mercy when I can." Martha Peterson had brought him a fresh loaf of bread that morning, and Tom Peterson had offered to help repair his fences. The town's quiet acceptance meant more than any whispered legends. They'd seen him choose warning shots over killing, seen him try to talk Cole down, seen him spare a man's life when justice didn't demand death. As he headed back to his ranch, McCall realized that sometimes keeping the peace meant being ready to defend it. Sarah would have understood that. A month later, life on the Willow Creek Ranch had returned to its familiar rhythm. McCall mended fences, tended cattle, and watched the seasons change. His guns remained clean and ready, but they were tools now, not burdens. The legend of Shadowhand McCall had grown quieter, tempered by the truth finally told in court. A letter arrived from Elizabeth Martinez, thanking him for setting the record straight after all these years. Her brother had found peace with the truth, she wrote, and even Cole had begun to come to terms with his father's lies behind prison walls. As McCall sat in Sarah's rocking chair that evening, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, he realized that true peace wasn't about avoiding violence, it was about knowing when to act and when to show mercy. Some legends, he decided, were worth living up to.